Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 199, January 1st to January 5th, 1864. Last week we had a different episode. We decided to preview a little bit of 1865, but we also ranked the movies we have watched on the Patreon so far, and also had some superlative picks for sites we visited and memoirs as well that we have read and reviewed. So hopefully you found that interesting, or it inspired you to maybe go check out the Patreon. Either way, I think it was nice to have a little bit of a change of a pace episode, run down those movies, and there will be more movies to come. It's not like we're finishing up with the movies, so we can keep adding to that list. This week, we will start off 1865 by setting the world stage. For our first event that occurs in the year 1865, we will stay in the United States, as we have John Deere receiving a patent on plows on February 21st. Now, John Deere was born in Vermont in 1804. Spending some time in the Green Mountain State, he would work as a blacksmith and eventually relocate to Illinois. It would be in the Midwestern state which he would develop his idea for a new plow. You see, the cast iron plows being used in the area were not as effective given the soil in the Midwest. Remember that Illinois this time is the gateway for people moving into homesteads to Nebraska and beyond. It is actually kind of interesting. We talked about the Black Hawk War in a previous episode, and even as back as the 1830s, Illinois is still kind of considered to be the frontier. You know, when Lincoln is coming up there, it's still a newer state. It's got a little bit more of a kind of Wild West vibe to it, I would say. And it's really hard for us to imagine maybe, but there's other places. Mississippi is one of those that's kind of like the same sort of attitude. We also look at a place like Missouri and Independence, moving into Kansas, and that's kind of like the gateway into your trail west, right? Everyone has played, some kind of version of maybe Oregon Trail, and you kind of start there, right? And so you have civilization, then civilization kind of ends until you get to the West Coast. So it is a very different way to look at the United States, I feel. Well, the soil that was particularly clay-like was going to be better served with a polished steel plow that Deere would develop with a bit of a different design too. He would begin to manufacture and distribute the plows very quickly to 75 to 100 a year in the 1840s. Deere would apply and receive the patent in 1865. He would relocate to Moline, Illinois, which is still the site of the corporate headquarters for John Deere. By 1855, 10,000 plows had been sold. In 1868, the business became incorporated. John Deere would briefly become mayor for a time and also president of a bank in Moline before his death in 1886. Control of the company would pass through his family. Eventually, in 1912, John Deere would start to produce tractors. During the Second War, they would continue production, including aiding in the war effort. In the modern day, there has been an emphasis on electric tractors and even self-driving tractors. So here we have a little bit of the history of John Deere that goes all the way back here into 1865, even before 1865, right? I think the logo, the green and the yellow, I think it's a very recognizable brand that you see here. And we probably don't think of as much as where these companies come from, how they get their start. So it's always very fascinating to go back and take a look. Speaking of companies, in Finland in 1865, we have the founding of Nokia. Now, Nokia would begin as a pulp mill founded by Fredrik Idestam. If you are not aware, a pulp mill is a facility that takes wood chips or plant matter and converts that into a board, which then can be used in paper manufacturing. The first mill was founded at the town of Tampere, but would then be moved to the town of Nokia due to a better water power supply. As such, there would be a hydropower portion of the business, eventually expanding into electricity in the 1900s. Cable and rubber plants would join the Nokia umbrella at this time. While the electricity, forestry, rubber, and cable would be the four main prongs of the company, they would also produce respirators and gas masks as well for the war efforts, the First and Second World War. Finland, of course, would break free from Russia, engaging in a war with that nation as well. Nokia would continue acquisitions into the mid and late 1900s. This would include continued electronics, eventually leading them to the mobile phone business. Oddly enough, the high-ups at the company thinking that they should not waste their time on gadgets that seemed like something out of a James Bond film. Today, Nokia continues to operate in the mobile business, as well as technology, and some manufacturing and shipping and submarines. They had a 2023 revenue of 23 billion euros, pretty wild having come from a pulp mill back in the same time as the American Civil War. In July of 1865, we have the Salvation Army being founded in London by Methodists William and Catherine Booth. Now, if you recall, we have talked about this before, that this is a time for some religious reformation, and so this was a partial offshoot of that. Even in the armies themselves, we actually see some religious revival. It is fairly interesting how you see in these first-hand accounts, there is an emphasis on those who are sort of morally just. They've gone through this reformation, they're finding this reformation, and those who are going to continue kind of in their ways, and there's kind of like a mix between the two. Remember, alcohol is kind of seen as this huge negative, gambling, huge negative. You have playing cards, negative again, and going into battle, sometimes these individuals who have gone through this reformation or sort of pseudo gone through, they're going to be throwing away their playing cards because if they get killed, they don't want to have the playing cards found on them, and thus, in death, they're going to be seen as this morally corruptible individual, right? So it is a little bit of a different view, I think, than, say, we would have in the modern era. But there are all these accounts, especially in the Confederate armies, where a lot of the unity, a lot of the coping with the way the war is going to be based on religion. So a lot of individuals that go into the army are going to have that solidified there. So that's another thing that I think we fail to mention sometimes when we're talking about these reformations. As mentioned, a big part of the religious themes of the day was temperance. Fighting against alcohol and addiction, amongst other things, would lead the Salvation Army to start its efforts. Although Salvation Army is not the name that will come into existence until 1878. Booth would mention that he had a volunteer army of outreach ministers, but that he was in fact a regular, eventually the name Salvation coming into being. The three S's were coined by the organization: soup, soap, and finally Salvation. The military theme would continue, with Booth declaring himself a general, with ministers, officers, and soldiers being lay people. They would expand to other countries, including the United States and Australia. Again, mostly, they would be combating alcoholism. A countryside area was reserved as a kind of escape, or even maybe sort of a rehab center in Essex, England in the meantime. Pub owners, upset that patrons who gave them valuable business were now gone, would spark some violence against the Salvation Army, the organization known as the Skeleton Army. Eventually, the Salvation Army would be one of the founding organizations of the USO. Today, they have a good many members across the world, still operating today. Certainly, maybe some of you have seen them in the Christmas season, bell ringing and collecting donations. In October of 1865, we have the Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica. Now, this is a relevant event, and that's connected heavily with the racial inequality we see in the United States during this time, so it's very close to home, so to speak. There is a reason why the United States had previously not recognized Haiti as a nation following their successful rebellion against the French. Indeed, had there not been a civil war going on, and the nation had remained at the previous status quo, it's very easy to imagine that the events as described would be a big point of continued derision, especially with the filibustering attempts in the area. Now, Jamaica had seen slavery abolished in the 1830s. Remember, we talked about how England was leading the charge in terms of emancipation and cracking down on the slave trade, which had been made illegal. But this did not mean that they were going to have a society welcoming of different races. Despite freedom, most continued to work under an apprenticeship program until 1838. Once at that date, there would be a poll tax that would restrict voting, as many could not afford it. Now, we are not yet to Reconstruction, but we have a little preview and comparison to what will eventually come to pass in unified America. Now, why exactly was this considered to be okay by the British? Well, remember, there had been a lot of fallout from the Haitian Revolution. This had been a particularly violent affair, with butcherings on both sides using machetes. Now, this would be less than appealing if you were white or even mixed race, as this had been the case in Haiti, there being sort of a revolution and then following that a civil war even. We talked about in some of our memoirs that this was a real fear. Remember, we talked about in our Moxley Sorrell memoir review, we talked about that in the Patreon, where early on it's actually kind of shaping of his view on things. There are some individuals in his family that were French that had come over, that had escaped there. So obviously they have a very bitter taste in their mouth when it comes to this particular area, and obviously rebellion, slave rebellion in particular, resulting from Haiti. Even we see George Thomas is actually very affected by the Nat Turner Rebellion. He's growing up in Virginia at the time, and obviously in what would be sort of the most successful, I guess you could say, none of them really succeeded, but the most successful slave rebellion, and the one which was probably the largest at the time, then yeah, there's definitely something that's going to kind of change you when you have this kind of way in which you're looking at the world. And then you have Nat Turner, and you have the violence that resulted from that rebellion. So the limiting of political power was seen as something to hopefully avoid such events. 2,000 out of a population of 400,000 were allowed to vote in the elections of 1864, so that gives you an idea about just how widespread the disparity was. Now you combine that with increasing tensions between white planters, drought, and disease moving over the island, and there you get a potential to rebellion. The sugar industry was not doing well, so it was rumored that instead of paying anyone, then there would be a return to enslavement. Paul Bogle, a Baptist minister, would develop many followers, taking poorer individuals into a particular region of the island. In October, things would come to a head, with a black man going on trial for trespassing on an abandoned plantation. A riot would ensue with 2 police officers being beaten. The following day, the riots would continue as a ragtag militia had been formed. The rioters would start to pelt the militia, who would open fire, sparking further violence that would see 25 deaths. The governor, John Eyre, who had downplayed the condition in Jamaica when reporting back to the crown, would declare martial law and send troops under General Alexander Nelson, who had served in Afghanistan and India in the 1840s. Violent suppression of the rebellion would begin. Bogle would be captured and eventually tried and executed. Quick convictions and whipping individuals would be widespread, some 400 becoming casualties. Under martial law, George William Gordon, a politician of mixed descent, would be tried and executed, not having any kind of connection to the rebellion at all. There would be a mixed reception to the rebellion and the violence. Many in England would decry the barbarity, but there were those who spoke up for Eyre, preventing him from being tried for murder. In the end, he would be removed, and Jamaica for a time would be ruled directly from London. Ironically, this would mean no more elected representation. So, when the whole spark of the rebellion, or is partially spark of the rebellion, would be that you can't vote, and then they're just going to completely take that off the table. Yeah, I guess that's one way to solve it. Eventually, Jamaica would gain independence in 1962. Gordon would be named a national hero along with Bogle, Gordon having the distinction of having his face on currency. To close out today, we have the birth of famous author Rudyard Kipling in 1865. Now, Kipling was born in Bombay and spent a large part of his life traveling, visiting many places, including South Africa and America, going back to England for a time. He would write several famous poems and works, including The Jungle Book, which included Rikki Tikki Tavi, a work many of us might have heard from grade school, and Captains Courageous. He would write for publications in his time, and also help by writing pro-nationalist items during the First World War. During that war, Kipling's only son would be killed at the Battle of Loos, something that greatly affected the author. After the war, he would join in a Graves Association, eventually dying in 1936. Kipling is sort of a controversial figure, as he was possibly writing for and supporting anti-independence in India. Not to mention, in the modern day, some of his themes may be more problematic. But I think we can close out today. We've done previously some poems in the actual narrative. We've done some poems here as part of a Patreon item. I encourage you to check that out if you want to hear some poems that were written about, mostly poems that were written during the Civil War, so I do have that. But here, I want to read, closing out today, my favorite poem from Rudyard Kipling. We will go with Gunga Din. You may talk a gin a beer, and when you're quartered safe out here, and you've sent to penny fights and Aldershot it. But when it comes to slaughter, you'll do your work on water, and you'll lick the bloomin' boots of him that's got it. Now in just sunny clime, where I used to spend my time, a servant of Her Majesty the Queen, all them blackened crew, the finest man I knew, was our regimental beastie Gunga Din. He was Din, 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 you limpin' lump o' brick dust Gunga Din. Hi, slippy hitherto, water to get it, panty low. You squidgy nose old idol Gunga Din. The uniform he wore was nothing much before, and rather less than enough that to begin. For a piece of twisty rag and a goatskin water bag was all the field equipment he could find. When the sweatin' troop train lay, in a sliding through the day, where the eat would make your bloomin' eyebrows crawl, we shouted Harry by till our throats were bricky dry. Then we whopped him 'cause he couldn't serve us all. It was Din, Din, Din. You even where the mischief have you been? You put some Julie in it, or I'll marry you this minute, if you don't fill up my helmet Gunga Din. He would don and carry on, till the long stay was done, and he didn't seem to know the use of fear. If we charged or broke or cut, you bet your bloomin' nut, he'd be waiting 50 paces right flank rear. With his music on his back, he would skip with our attack, and watch us till the bugles made retire. And all his dirty-eyed, he was white, clear white inside, when he went to tend the wounded under fire. It was Din, 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 with the bullets kicking dust butts on the green. When the cartridges ran out, you could hear a front rank shout, "Aye, ammunition mules and Gunga Din." I shan't forget the night when I dropped behind the fight, with a bullet where my belt plate should have been. I was choking mad with thirst, and man that's by me first was our good old grinning, grunting Gunga Din. He lifted up my head, and when he plunged me where I bled, and he offered me at a point of water green. It was crawling and it stunk, but of all the drinks I've drunk, I'm grateful to the one from Gunga Din. It was Din, Din, Din. Ere a beggar with a bullet through his spleen. He's chawing up the ground, and he's kicking all around. For God's sake, get the water, Gunga Din. He carried me away to where a dooley lay, and a bullet come and drilled the beggar clean. He put me safe inside, and just before he died, "I hope you like your drink," says Gunga Din. So I'll meet him later on, at the place where he is gone, where it's always double drill and no canteen. He'll be squatting on the coals, giving drink to poor damn souls, and I'll get a swig in hell from Gunga Din. Yes, Din, Din, Din. You Lazarus in leather, Gunga Din, though I've bought and flayed you, by the living God that made you. You're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. Now, it might not surprise you to know that a couple things, right? There was a movie, Gunga Din, and that was one of my favorites as a kid. It might also surprise you to know that I actually memorized part of that poem, partially. You know, it was like that, and it was Charge of the Light Brigade. We had to do poems. I wasn't about, the ones that were like 3 lines, haiku. Nah, I'm going to go ahead and take off this hard way. Even reading it, it's pretty hard, just because it's kind of in a slang sort of way written. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Maybe you've heard that before. Maybe you've seen the movie before. Go check out the movie. It's actually a pretty decent watch. Not too long. Very entertaining, I'd say. So we'll close out the episode there. We got a handful of events that kept us in America with John Deere, as well as others that took us abroad. We also had the birth of Rudyard Kipling, and that gives us an excuse to read one of my favorite poems, Gunga Din. Next week, we will have a little bit of a lighter episode as well. We'll always talk about the beginning of the peace talks between the North and the South being conducted by Francis Preston Blair Sr. We will also go over some soldiers' accounts of life in the field, so we have a good idea of what that was like as well. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.